The sun was setting behind the hills, casting long shadows across the trail. The forest around Lucas Andrade was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot and the distant chirping of birds settling in for the night. Running had always been his escape, a way to outrun the ghosts of the life he used to know, the life he left behind after the injury that ended his career as a professional athlete. The air was crisp, biting at his skin as he pushed himself harder, trying to silence the thoughts swirling in his mind. But then something stopped him in his tracks. A sound, barely audible at first, broke through the rhythm of his footsteps. He paused, tilting his head, straining to listen. It was faint, like a soft whimper carried by the wind. He turned, following the sound deeper into the woods. It grew louder, more distinct. Someone was crying. Lucas's heart quickened as he moved through the trees, his eyes scanning the fading light. And then he saw her, a small figure huddled beneath the branches of an old oak tree. A girl, no more than 10 or 11, curled up tightly with her arms wrapped around her knees, her face buried in her arms as she sobbed quietly. "Hey," Lucas called softly, taking a careful step closer. "Are you okay?" The girl didn't respond right away. She seemed to tense up, her sobs halting for a moment as she lifted her head just enough to peek at him through the tangled strands of her hair. Her eyes were wide and scared, glistening with tears. She looked lost. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice gentle, as if trying not to frighten her. "I just want to help. Are you lost?" For a second, she stared at him, as if deciding whether she could trust him. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded. I don't know how to get home," she whispered, her voice shaky and weak. Lucas crouched down to her level, trying to make himself seem less intimidating. "It's okay. I'll help you get back. What's your name?" "Clara," she murmured, her voice barely audible. He offered her a small smile. "Hi, Clara. I'm Lucas. Let's get you out of here, okay? It's getting dark and it's too cold for you to stay here." She hesitated, glancing around the forest as if unsure. Lucas could see she was scared, not just of the dark woods, but of him too. She didn't know if she could trust this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere, but she was also alone, lost, and clearly desperate. "I have a house not too far from here," Lucas said softly. "You can come with me and we'll figure out how to get you home in the morning. Does that sound okay?" Clara looked at him, then at the trees surrounding them, and finally, with a trembling breath, she nodded. Slowly, she reached out and took the hand he extended toward her. Her small fingers felt cold against his, and as he helped her to her feet, Lucas couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for the girl. She looked so fragile, so out of place in the middle of the woods. As they walked back along the trail, Lucas kept his pace slow, making sure not to rush her. Every now and then, he glanced down at her worn-out shoes and the dirt smudged on her clothes. She hadn't been out here for long, but long enough to leave her looking exhausted and scared. "What were you doing out here, Clara?" he asked after a few minutes of walking, trying to make conversation and ease her nerves. I was trying to find my way back, but I got lost," she said quietly. I don't know the way." Her voice was shaky, barely above a whisper, and Lucas could hear the fear laced in her words. She was clearly holding back from saying more, but he didn't want to push her. Not yet. They reached his house just as the last bit of daylight faded into twilight. The place was modest but warm, nestled at the edge of the forest. Lucas opened the door and motioned for Clara to step inside. She hesitated for a moment before cautiously walking in, her eyes wide as she took in her surroundings. "This is your house?" she asked, her voice soft, almost awed. Lucas nodded. "Yeah, it's not much, but it's home." She stood there looking around as if she wasn't sure what to do next. Lucas noticed her shivering and quickly grabbed a blanket from the couch, wrapping it around her shoulders. "Here, this will warm you up. You must be freezing." Clara gave a small nod of thanks, her hands clutching the edges of the blanket as she pulled it tighter around herself. Lucas watched her for a moment, wondering what to do next. He had never been great with kids, especially not scared, lost ones. You can stay here tonight, he said, breaking the silence. We'll figure everything out in the morning, okay? Clara looked up at him, her eyes still full of uncertainty, but after a long pause, she nodded. Thank you, she whispered, her voice so quiet it was almost lost in the room. The night passed quietly. Clara had slept in one of the guest rooms, wrapped tightly in the blanket Lucas had given her. He, on the other hand, had barely slept at all. His mind kept spinning with questions. Who was this girl? Why was she out there all alone? And why did she seem so afraid, not just of the woods, but of something deeper? Morning sunlight filtered through the curtains as Lucas brewed coffee in the kitchen. He wasn't sure what the day ahead would bring, but one thing was clear. Clara needed help, and until he figured out exactly how to provide it, she was staying here. Clara wandered into the kitchen, still clutching the blanket. Her hair was tangled from sleep, and she looked at Lucas with a mixture of curiosity and hesitation. Morning, Lucas said, offering her a warm smile. You sleep okay? Clara shrugged, standing awkwardly by the door. I guess. You hungry? I can make some eggs or pancakes? He wasn't much of a cook, but he figured kids liked pancakes. At least that's what he'd seen in movies. Pancakes are fine, Clara mumbled, her voice small. As Lucas got to work in the kitchen, flipping pancakes and trying to figure out how to approach the subject of why she was out in the woods, Clara stood by the window, gazing out at the forest. She seemed distant, lost in thought, and Lucas couldn't help but wonder what was going through her mind. So, Clara, he began cautiously, trying to keep his tone light. Do you want to talk about what happened yesterday? How you ended up out there? She stiffened, her fingers gripping the edges of the blanket a little tighter. For a moment, Lucas thought she wasn't going to answer, but then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't have anywhere to go. Lucas paused, the spatula hovering over the pan. What do you mean? Clara turned to face him, her expression guarded. I used to live with my parents, but they're gone now. After that, I stayed with some people for a while, but it wasn't home. I didn't fit in. So, I left. Lucas set the spatula down, his heart sinking. He hadn't expected something so heavy, especially not from someone so young. I'm really sorry, Clara, he said softly. That must have been really hard. Clara shrugged again, as if trying to brush it off, but Lucas could see the pain in her eyes. She had clearly been through a lot, and the last thing she needed was to feel pressured to talk about it. He decided to change the subject. You said yesterday you like running, he said, hoping to lighten the mood. Have you done any training before? Clara looked up at him, a flicker of something like excitement passing through her eyes. I used to run a lot. Before everything. Lucas smiled. Well, I'm a coach, you know. Maybe we can do some training together, if you're up for it. She blinked, clearly surprised by the offer. You'd train me? Sure, Lucas replied, his smile growing. If you want to, that is. It might be a good way to clear your head. Running always helps me when I'm stressed. Clara seemed to consider it for a moment before giving a small nod. Okay, yeah, I'd like that. Later that morning, Lucas took Clara outside to the clearing near his house, where he usually trained alone. The space was open, the trees lining the edge like silent spectators. Clara stood there, looking unsure but intrigued. You ready? Lucas asked, stretching his arms and trying to set a casual tone. Clara nodded, her fingers fiddling nervously with the hem of her shirt. Lucas noticed her worn-out sneakers again. They were clearly not meant for running. He made a mental note to get her a new pair as soon as possible. All right, Lucas said. Let's start slow. We'll jog around this area a few times, just to warm up. They began to jog, Lucas keeping his pace easy so Clara could keep up. At first, she seemed hesitant, like she was holding back, but after a while, she found her rhythm. Lucas watched her closely, noticing how naturally she moved. There was potential there. Raw, untapped potential. After a few laps, they stopped to catch their breath. Clara wiped sweat from her forehead, her breathing a little heavy, but her eyes sparkled with something that hadn't been there before. How'd that feel? Lucas asked, smiling as he handed her a bottle of water. Good, she said, a small but genuine smile breaking through. Really good. Great. You've got a natural stride, Lucas noted. With a little training, you could be really fast. Clara's face lit up for a brief moment, but then something shifted in her expression. She hesitated, her smile fading as she looked down at the ground. I'm scared to go too fast, she admitted quietly. Lucas frowned. Scared? Why? Clara bit her lip, looking conflicted. It's just, after the accident, I don't like feeling out of control. Lucas felt a pang of sympathy. It was obvious now. The trauma of losing her parents in that accident had left scars that went beyond the physical. Speed, control, the fear of losing both. It was all tangled up in her past. Hey, he said gently, you don't have to push yourself if you're not ready. We can go at your pace, okay? Running is about more than just speed. It's about feeling free, finding your own rhythm. Clara nodded, though the worry didn't entirely leave her face. But Lucas could see that spark of determination flickering in her eyes again. She wasn't giving up. Let's take it one step at a time, Lucas continued. You've already got the heart of a runner. The rest will come. Over the next few days, Clara's training picked up pace. Lucas kept the sessions steady, gradually increasing the difficulty without pushing her too hard. She was improving, faster than he expected. Every morning they'd run through the forest trails, practicing form, endurance, and breathing techniques. But there was something else, something Lucas couldn't ignore. A wall Clara had built around herself, one that running couldn't break down. She was getting stronger physically, that much was clear. But every time they'd approach any sort of sprint or try a more intense drill, she hesitated. Lucas noticed it in the way she'd slow down, almost as if fear gripped her. It wasn't just about stamina, it was something deeper. One afternoon, after a particularly slow sprint session, Lucas decided to confront it head-on. Clara was sitting on the grass, catching her breath, staring blankly at the distance. Lucas sat down beside her, offering her a bottle of water. Clara, he said, trying to keep his voice gentle, you've been doing really well. You've got so much potential, but I can see you're holding back. Clara didn't say anything right away. She kept her eyes fixed on the ground, her fingers nervously playing with a blade of grass. I told you before, she said after a long pause. I don't like going fast. It makes me feel like I'm going to lose control. Lucas nodded, having expected this answer. I get that, he replied, but I want to help you work through that. You're stronger than you think, Clara. She looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. What if I'm not? Lucas shook his head. You are. I've seen it. It's not about being fearless. It's about pushing through that fear. You can't let it control you. Clara sighed, her shoulders slumping. I don't know how to stop being scared. Lucas stayed quiet for a moment, thinking. He understood where she was coming from. After all, he had his own battles with fear. Fear of failure, fear of letting people down. But he didn't want to overwhelm her with his own issues. She had enough to deal with already. Look, Lucas said finally, we don't have to push it right now. We'll take it slow. But I want you to trust yourself. Trust that you've got what it takes. Clara didn't respond, but the look in her eyes told him she was listening, even if she wasn't ready to fully believe it yet. As days passed, Lucas found himself growing more attached to Clara. He didn't just see her as a student or a trainee anymore. She was becoming part of his life in ways he hadn't anticipated. The quiet mornings, the laughter when she finally broke through a new challenge, the way she looked at him like she was starting to trust him, all of it stirred something deep inside him. But with that attachment came fear. Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that he might not be able to give her what she needed. He had his own scars, his own insecurities, and the thought of failing her scared him more than he wanted to admit. One evening, after a particularly tough training session, Lucas sat alone in the living room, staring at the floor. Clara had already gone to bed, exhausted but smiling after their long run. It had been a good day, one of the better ones. She had pushed herself more than usual, and Lucas had felt proud watching her grow. But as the house grew quiet, the doubt started creeping back in. Could he really take care of her? Could he be the figure she needed? Someone stable? Someone she could rely on? He was still wrestling with those thoughts when he heard a small voice from the doorway. "Lucas?" He turned to see Clara standing there, looking uncertain. I couldn't sleep," she said softly. Lucas motioned for her to come in, and she padded over to sit beside him on the couch. She didn't say anything for a while, and neither did he. The silence between them felt heavy, like both of them were carrying more than they knew how to express. "Lucas," Clara finally whispered, "do you think I'll ever be able to run without being afraid?" He looked at her, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes, and it broke his heart. She was just a kid, dealing with things no one her age should have to deal with. And here he was, afraid of failing her, when all she needed was someone to believe in her. "You will," Lucas said, his voice firm. "It's going to take time, but I know you will. You're brave, Clara, braver than you realize." Clara looked down at her hands, nodding slowly, but then she surprised him. "What about you?" she asked quietly. "Are you still afraid?" Lucas felt his chest tighten. He hadn't expected her to turn the question back on him, but there it was, a mirror to his own fears. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. How could he admit to her that he was just as scared, maybe even more? "Yeah," he admitted softly. "I am. I'm afraid of a lot of things." Clara looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "Like what?" Lucas hesitated, but then he decided to be honest. "I'm afraid I won't be able to help you the way you need. I'm afraid I'll let you down." Clara blinked, clearly taken aback. She hadn't expected him to say that. "But you've been helping me a lot. I wouldn't have gotten this far without you." Lucas gave her a small, sad smile. "I'm trying, Clara. I really am. But sometimes I feel like I'm not enough." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then slowly, Clara reached out and took his hand. Her grip was small but strong, and Lucas felt the weight of her trust in that simple gesture. "You are enough," she whispered. Lucas felt something shift inside him. Maybe he didn't have all the answers. Maybe he wasn't perfect. But in that moment, sitting there with Clara, he realized that being there, truly being present for her, was enough. And maybe that was all she really needed. The next morning was colder than usual, the kind of crisp air that made every breath feel sharp. Lucas and Clara had just finished their warm-up jog when they were interrupted by the sound of tires crunching on gravel. A car was pulling up the driveway. Lucas turned to look, his brow furrowed. He wasn't expecting anyone. Clara slowed down, her eyes fixed on the car with a mixture of curiosity and unease. When the car stopped and the door opened, a woman stepped out. She was in her early 40s, with a sharp, professional demeanor. There was something about the way she carried herself that immediately put Lucas on edge. "Lucas Andrade?" the woman asked, her voice formal as she approached. "Yeah, that's me," Lucas replied, his tone cautious. "Can I help you?" The woman offered a thin smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "My name is Emily Parker. I'm with Child Protective Services." Lucas's stomach dropped. He glanced at Clara, who had gone pale, her body stiffening beside him. Whatever was coming next, he knew it wasn't good. "I've been assigned to Clara's case," Emily continued, her gaze shifting to the girl. "We've been looking for her for a while." Clara took a step back, instinctively moving closer to Lucas. He could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear that had been there when he first found her in the forest. She wasn't just scared of the situation. She was scared of being taken away. "Wait," Lucas said, trying to process what was happening. "Clara's been here with me. She's safe. Why are you here now?" Emily sighed, her expression softening slightly. "I understand this must be overwhelming, but Clara has been through a lot. She's been in the system for a while, and when she disappeared, we were worried. I'm here to make sure she's okay and to figure out the best next steps." "The best next steps?" Lucas echoed, feeling a surge of protectiveness rising in his chest. "She's been doing fine here. I've been looking after her." "I don't doubt that," Emily said calmly. "But Clara's situation is complicated. She doesn't have any legal guardians right now, and we need to assess what's best for her long term." Clara's grip on Lucas's arm tightened. He could feel her trembling, though she was trying to hide it. The idea of going back into the system, of being shuffled from place to place again, was clearly terrifying her. "No," Clara blurted out, her voice shaking. "I don't want to go back. Please don't take me away." Emily's expression remained neutral, though there was a hint of sympathy in her eyes. "Clara, I understand how you feel, but we have procedures we need to follow. We can't just leave you here without a proper investigation." Lucas knelt down beside Clara, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Hey, it's going to be okay," he said softly, though he wasn't entirely sure if he believed his own words. "We'll figure this out." Clara shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "I don't want to go with her, Lucas. I want to stay here." Lucas stood up, facing Emily again. "Look," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't know what your protocol is, but Clara has been doing better here. She's improving. She's safe. Can't that count for something?" Emily hesitated, clearly sensing the tension in the air. "I'm not here to take her away today," she explained, "but I do need to conduct a formal assessment. Clara's well-being is our top priority, and we need to make sure this is the right environment for her." Lucas's jaw clenched. He understood the logic, but it didn't make the situation any easier. Clara had just started to trust him, and now everything was being thrown into chaos again. "I'll need to schedule a visit," Emily continued, pulling out a clipboard. "In the meantime, I recommend you gather any documentation that could help clarify the situation. School records, medical information, anything that could show Clara's progress." "Fine," Lucas muttered, feeling a knot tighten in his chest. "But you should know, I'm not giving up on her." Emily nodded, making a note on her clipboard. "I'll be in touch soon." As she turned to leave, Clara's body seemed to deflate with relief, though her face was still pale, her expression distant. Lucas waited until the car had pulled away before turning to her. "Clara," he began gently, but she cut him off. "I don't want to leave," she said, her voice raw. "I can't go back to that life. I don't belong there." Lucas's heart ached. He knelt down again, looking her in the eyes. "I'm not going to let them take you away, okay? We'll figure this out together." Clara stared at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt. Finally, she nodded, though the fear lingered in her expression. Lucas knew this wasn't going to be easy. The system was complicated, and he wasn't entirely sure what the next steps would be. But one thing was clear. He wasn't about to let Clara slip through the cracks again. That night, Lucas couldn't sleep. His mind was racing with thoughts of what Emily had said. The system was a maze of red tape, and he had no idea how he was going to navigate it. But he also knew he couldn't fail Clara, not after everything she'd been through. Sitting at the kitchen table, he found himself staring at an old photo on the wall, one from his days as an athlete, back when he had everything figured out. Back then, he was so sure of his path, so confident in who he was. Now he wasn't sure of anything, except one thing. Clara deserved better than the life she'd had so far. As he sat there, thinking about all the obstacles ahead, he made a decision. He was going to fight for Clara, no matter what it took. She needed stability. She needed someone who believed in her, and most of all, she needed a family. The sky had been darkening all afternoon, but neither Lucas nor Clara had expected the storm to come on so quickly. They had been training on the trails behind Lucas's house, pushing through a more intense workout than usual. Clara had been in a good mood that day, more confident in her running, more determined to improve. For once, she didn't seem held back by her fear. But now, the wind had picked up, howling through the trees, and the first drops of rain were starting to fall. The storm was coming faster than either of them had anticipated. "We should head back," Lucas called over the wind, his voice steady but urgent. Clara nodded, her pace slowing as they turned back toward the house. The rain was coming down harder now, soaking through their clothes and making the trail slick with mud. Every step felt heavier, the ground becoming more treacherous with each passing minute. Then it happened. Lucas's foot hit a patch of wet leaves, and in an instant, he slipped. He twisted awkwardly, and Clara heard a sharp gasp of pain as he fell to the ground, clutching his knee, the same knee that had ended his career. "Lucas!" Clara screamed, running back to him. He was on the ground, grimacing in pain, his hands gripping his leg. "It's my knee," Lucas said through gritted teeth. "I think I've done something to it again." Clara's heart raced, panic rising in her chest. The rain was pouring down now, turning the trail into a muddy mess. Lucas was hurt, and they were still a good distance from the house. They couldn't wait out the storm here. They needed help. I'll get help," Clara stammered, her voice trembling with fear. Lucas looked at her, his face pale from the pain, but his eyes calm. "Clara, listen to me," he said, his voice steady despite everything. "You can do this. You need to run back to the house. You need to go fast, okay? You have to trust yourself." Clara froze, her mind racing. Fast. She hated going fast. It made her feel out of control, like everything was slipping away from her. The memory of the accident that took her parents flashed through her mind. The screech of tires, the sickening spin of the car. She had spent so long running away from that feeling. I can't," Clara whispered, her hands shaking. "I'm scared, Lucas." "I know you're scared," Lucas said softly, wincing as he shifted his leg. "But you're stronger than you think. You've been training for this. You're ready." Clara felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. She looked at Lucas, lying there in the mud, and realized that this wasn't just about her anymore. Lucas needed her. His life could depend on it. And for the first time, she realized that she had to be the one to save him. "Okay," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Okay." Without another word, Clara turned and ran. The wind whipped through her hair, and the rain pelted her face as she sprinted down the trail. Her heart was pounding in her chest, every beat echoing her fear. The ground was slick, and her shoes slid in the mud, but she kept pushing, faster than she'd ever dared to go before. Every part of her body screamed to stop, to slow down, but she couldn't. She wouldn't. Lucas needed her, and that was all that mattered. For once, the fear of losing control wasn't enough to stop her. She felt it there, lurking just below the surface, but she kept running. Her legs burned, her lungs ached, but still, she ran. Trees blurred past her as she flew down the trail, the rain turning everything into a chaotic mess of gray and green. She stumbled once, her foot catching on a root, but she caught herself and kept going. The house was in sight now. She could see it through the trees just a little further. The relief that washed over her was quickly replaced by another wave of determination. She had made it this far. She wasn't going to let anything stop her now. She burst through the front door, breathless and soaked to the bone. "Help!" she yelled, her voice hoarse. "Lucas is hurt! I need help!" Mary, the housekeeper, came rushing into the hallway, her eyes wide with concern. "What happened?" she asked urgently. "His knee," Clara gasped, her hands still shaking from the run. "He's hurt bad, in the storm. I don't know how long he can stay out there." Mary didn't waste any time. She grabbed the phone and called for emergency services, relaying the situation quickly and efficiently. Clara stood there, shivering and trying to catch her breath, the adrenaline still pumping through her veins. It wasn't long before the sound of sirens filled the air. Clara watched as the paramedics arrived, and she led them back through the storm to where Lucas lay. He was still in pain, but he smiled when he saw her. "You did it," Lucas said quietly as they loaded him onto a stretcher. "I knew you could." Clara didn't say anything, but she felt a sense of pride swell in her chest. She had done it. She had faced her fear, and she had saved him. Hours later, after the storm had passed and Lucas was safely at the hospital, Clara sat alone in the living room, still trying to process everything that had happened. The house felt strangely quiet, the hum of the storm replaced by an eerie calm. Mary sat down beside her, offering her a cup of tea. "You did well today," she said softly. Clara nodded, though her mind was still racing. She had been so scared, but in the end, the fear hadn't stopped her. She had pushed through it, just like Lucas had taught her. Lucas is going to be okay, Mary added, as if sensing Clara's lingering worry. The doctors said it's nothing they can't fix. Clara felt a wave of relief wash over her. Lucas was going to be okay. And more than that, she had proven to herself that she could do it. She had trusted herself, and it had made all the difference. For the first time in a long time, Clara felt like she belonged somewhere. She wasn't just a lost girl anymore. She was strong, she was capable, and she was ready for whatever came next. The hospital room was quiet, save for the steady beeping of the machines and the soft hum of the air conditioner. Lucas lay in the bed, his leg wrapped in a brace, a look of exhaustion and relief on his face. The doctors had told him the damage to his knee wasn't as bad as it could have been. He would recover, but it would take time. Clara sat beside him, her hands fidgeting in her lap. The adrenaline from the storm had long since faded, leaving her feeling drained and uncertain. She hadn't spoken much since they'd arrived at the hospital, her mind still replaying everything that had happened. The fear, the run, the moment she thought she wouldn't make it. It all felt like a blur now, but the weight of it still clung to her. Lucas turned his head slightly, watching her. "Hey," he said softly, his voice raspy. "You've been quiet." Clara looked up at him, meeting his gaze for the first time since they'd arrived. I'm just glad you're okay," she murmured. Lucas smiled, though the pain in his leg was still evident in the way he moved. "Thanks to you." Clara shifted in her seat, feeling a mix of emotions she didn't know how to express. Pride, relief, fear. It was all tangled up inside her, and she wasn't sure how to untangle it. "You did something amazing today, Clara," Lucas continued, his voice gentle but firm. "You saved my life." Clara shook her head. "I was so scared, Lucas. I almost didn't do it. I almost didn't run." "But you did," Lucas pointed out. "You didn't let the fear stop you. That's what matters." Clara bit her lip, her fingers tightening around the edges of her jacket. I don't know. I didn't want to lose you too." Lucas's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of understanding. "I know it hasn't been easy for you, but Clara, you're not alone anymore. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Clara blinked, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. She had spent so long feeling like she was always on the edge of losing everything. First her parents, then the constant fear of being sent away. But Lucas, he was different. He had stayed, even when things got hard. "I don't want to go back into the system," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't want to leave." Lucas's expression softened. He had been thinking about this moment for a while now, ever since Emily from Child Protective Services had shown up. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, but he had already made up his mind. "You're not going anywhere," Lucas said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "I've been thinking about it a lot, and I want to make sure you never have to go back to that life." Clara looked at him, her eyes wide with hope, but also hesitation. "What do you mean?" Lucas took a deep breath, wincing slightly as he adjusted his position in the bed. "I mean, I want to adopt you, Clara. I want you to stay here, with me, for good." For a moment, Clara just stared at him, as if she hadn't fully processed the words. Then, slowly, her face softened, and the tears that had been threatening to fall finally spilled over. "You really want me to stay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," Lucas said, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I really do." Clara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her chest tight with emotion. She had spent so long feeling like she didn't belong anywhere, like she was always on the verge of being sent away again. But now she had a home. Now she had someone who wanted her to stay. "I'd like that," Clara whispered, her voice shaky with emotion. "I'd really like that." Lucas reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "We'll figure everything out. It won't be easy, but I promise you, Clara, I'm not going anywhere. You're part of my family now." Clara looked down at their joined hands, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. For the first time in what felt like forever, She felt safe. She felt like she belonged. The next few days passed in a blur of paperwork, doctor visits, and quiet moments of reflection. Lucas was discharged from the hospital with strict instructions to rest and let his knee heal. Clara stayed by his side through it all, helping him around the house, though he could see the worry still lingering in her eyes. Emily from Child Protective Services visited again, this time with a different tone. Lucas had explained his intentions to adopt Clara, and while the process was complicated and filled with bureaucratic hurdles, Emily seemed genuinely pleased with the decision. "You've built something good here," Emily said during one of her visits. "It's clear that Clara has found a place where she feels safe." Lucas glanced at Clara, who was sitting across the room, pretending not to listen but clearly paying attention to every word. "Yeah," Lucas replied softly. "She deserves that." Emily nodded, making a few notes on her clipboard. "The process will take time, but we'll start it as soon as possible." After Emily left, Lucas found Clara sitting quietly in her room, staring out the window. He knocked gently on the door frame before stepping inside. "Everything's moving forward," Lucas said, leaning against the wall. "It's going to take a while, but we're on the right track." Clara nodded, but she didn't say anything. Lucas could see the worry still etched on her face, and he knew what she was thinking. "I meant what I said, Clara," he said softly, walking over and sitting beside her. "I'm not giving up on this. I'm not giving up on you." Clara looked at him, her eyes full of uncertainty. "What if something goes wrong?" Lucas smiled gently. "We'll handle it. Whatever happens, we'll handle it together." For a long moment, Clara didn't respond. Then, slowly, she leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. Lucas wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "You're not alone anymore," Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible. "Not ever again." Clara closed her eyes, letting the warmth of his words sink in. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she had to run. She didn't feel like she was lost. She was home. The weeks that followed felt like a new start. The house, once filled with silence and the weight of Lucas's solitude, now echoed with the sound of laughter and life. Clara had settled in, slowly but surely, finding her rhythm in this place she now called home. The adoption process was moving forward, and though it was complicated, they both knew that the hardest part was already behind them. Lucas, still recovering from his knee injury, spent most of his days resting and focusing on getting back on his feet. Clara, ever the eager helper, stayed by his side, offering him support in ways that made him smile, from helping him walk around the house to making sure he didn't overdo it on his crutches. "You know, you'd make a great nurse," Lucas joked one morning as Clara helped him into a chair on the porch. Clara shrugged, a small smile on her face. "Just returning the favor," she said simply. "You've helped me enough." The air was crisp, but the sun was warm as they sat on the porch together, overlooking the familiar trails that wound through the forest. It was quiet, peaceful, the kind of peace Lucas had been searching for all those years, but hadn't found until Clara came into his life. "You ever think about running again?" Lucas asked after a moment of silence, glancing at her out of the corner of his eye. Clara tilted her head, considering the question. "Maybe," she said after a beat. "I don't know. It doesn't scare me as much anymore." Lucas smiled. "That's because you've faced it." Clara nodded, though she didn't say anything. She didn't need to. They both knew what she had overcome, not just the fear of running fast, but the fear of losing control, of being lost and alone. And now, sitting there beside Lucas, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: safety. The afternoon stretched on, the golden sunlight filtering through the trees. After a while, Clara stood up, stretching her arms above her head. "I think I'm going to run today," she said suddenly, her voice light but determined. Lucas raised an eyebrow, surprised but pleased. "Yeah?" "Yeah," Clara nodded, glancing at the trail. "Just around here. Nothing crazy." Lucas grinned. "I'll be here watching. You've got this." Clara smiled back, and with a quick nod, She jogged down the porch steps, heading for the trail that looped around the property. Lucas watched her go, pride swelling in his chest. She moved with more confidence now, her steps steady and sure, no longer held back by the fear that had once gripped her. He leaned back in his chair, a sense of contentment settling over him. There had been a time when he thought his life had no direction, no purpose beyond the routines of his day-to-day existence. But Clara had changed that. She had given him something to fight for, something to believe in again. And in helping her, he had found a sense of peace that he hadn't even realized he was missing. Minutes passed, and then Clara came jogging back into view, her face flushed with exertion, but her expression bright. She slowed as she reached the porch, wiping the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "How was it?" Lucas asked, his smile widening as he saw the spark in her eyes. "Good," Clara said, slightly out of breath but clearly happy. "Really good." Lucas nodded, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "You did great." Clara sat down beside him, catching her breath. "Thanks," she said quietly. Then, after a pause, she added, "I'm thinking I might want to join a team, like a running club or something." Lucas's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Really?" Clara nodded, a shy smile tugging at her lips. "Yeah, I think I'm ready to run for real now." Lucas felt a surge of pride. Clara had come so far in such a short amount of time. She wasn't just running from her fears anymore. She was running towards something, a future, a life, and he was honored to be a part of it. "You know I'll help you with whatever you need," Lucas said, his voice steady. "You've got this, Clara, and I'll be right here cheering you on." Clara looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet gratitude. "I know," she said softly. "I know." The days turned into weeks, and the process of making Clara officially part of Lucas's life continued. They attended meetings, signed papers, and worked through the endless steps of bureaucracy. But none of it felt like a burden. It felt like the beginning of something solid, something permanent. One crisp morning, as they were leaving the lawyer's office, Clara stopped on the sidewalk and turned to Lucas, her eyes sparkling with a rare, unguarded happiness. "So, I'm officially yours now?" she said, her smile widening. Lucas chuckled, pulling her into a gentle hug. "Yeah," he said softly, "and I'm officially yours." Clara hugged him back, her grip tight, and for a moment neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. The world outside continued to move, but for them, in that quiet moment, everything felt right. A few months later, Lucas and Clara stood at the edge of a local track, the sun high in the sky and the scent of fresh grass filling the air. It was Clara's first official run with the local team, and Lucas could see the nervous excitement on her face. "You ready for this?" Lucas asked, his tone playful but supportive. Clara nodded, glancing at the other runners warming up. "Yeah, I'm ready." "You're going to do great," Lucas said, his voice filled with pride. "Just remember, it's not about being the fastest, it's about doing your best. That's what matters." Clara smiled, her confidence shining through. "I know, thanks, Lucas." He gave her a thumbs up as she walked toward the starting line, blending in with the other runners. As Lucas watched her prepare for the race, he felt a swell of emotions. Clara had transformed from the scared, lost girl he had found in the forest into someone who was strong, confident, and determined to face whatever came her way. The race began, and Lucas stood at the sidelines, cheering her on as she ran. She moved with grace and purpose, her strides long and sure. And though Lucas knew she wasn't the fastest runner on the track, that didn't matter. What mattered was that she was running toward her future, and she was doing it without fear. And in that moment, as he watched her cross the finish line, Lucas knew that they had both found what they had been searching for all along: home, family, and the courage to keep moving forward. Enjoyed this story? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories like this one. Hit the notification bell so you never miss out on new chapters filled with inspiration, resilience, and unforgettable moments. Your subscription is what keeps us motivated to bring you stories that touch the heart.